She didn't cry. Not at first. She just stood there, her veil catching the wind like a torn sail. The bouquet slipping slowly from her trembling hand and landing in the dry dust outside the chapel. The guests had already turned away. The music had stopped mid-song. The groom was gone, and in the choking silence that followed, all that remained was the sound of boots crunching gravel and whispers thick with pity. Clara May had always believed in the magic of small towns, their warmth, their closeness, their promises. But today, it all shattered in a blur of ivory lace and shame. Her white dress, once a symbol of dreams, now clung to her like a cruel joke. The town preacher wouldn't meet her eyes. Her aunt had quietly taken the ring from her hand, muttering something about saving face, and walked off without looking back. Everyone left like she was a storm they couldn't bear to watch for. She didn't move for what felt like hours. The sun baked the dirt under her heels, her shadow growing long and lonely. The church bell, which was supposed to toll for celebration, stayed silent, like it, too, had been betrayed in that hollow space between being a bride and becoming a ghost. Clara May felt something inside her harden. Not bitterness, not yet, but a cold numbness, like her heart had stopped recognizing hope as something she could own. Her father hadn't come. He never did. Her mother was buried on that very land just over the hill. And Clara May had worn the same lace she once wore, hoping to bring legacy to life again. But legacies, it seemed, were just as fragile as dreams in dusty towns. What broke her wasn't the man who left her at the altar. It was how quickly the people who claimed to love her disappeared like she was a mistake. No one wanted to remember. She wandered away from the chapel in silence, her bare feet catching on stones and roots, the train of her dress collecting earth. Behind her like a white flag dragged through defeat. She didn't know where she was going. Just away, far from the pity, the whispers, and the questions she never wanted to answer. She walked until the chapel disappeared behind her, and then she walked more, until the fields turned wild and unfamiliar. The old barn on the edge of Comanche land had long been forgotten. Its roof sagged, its doors hung crooked, but it welcomed her like a wounded thing might find comfort in another's ruin. She sat in the corner where hay no longer grew, curled into herself and let the heat of the day pass without notice. That night, as stars burned above her like silver fire, she realized the world had turned cold. Not from wind, but from absence. Clara May didn't speak for 3 days. She drank from the nearby stream and waited for hunger to teach her something. About survival, it didn't. Hunger didn't care if you were heartbroken. It just reminded you that you were still alive. She watched the town from the hilltop, saw the life continue as if she'd never existed. The wedding announcements were removed from store windows. The bakery stopped preparing the cake. Her name faded like a chalk drawing left out in the rain. But fate, if such a thing existed, never liked to leave stories unfinished. On the 4th day, just as Clara May was about to walk farther into nowhere, she heard hooves. Slow, steady, and certain. She turned, not expecting anything except perhaps a curious rider or a passing traveler. But what rode over that ridge wasn't ordinary. The horse was tall, jet black, with a silver saddle that shimmered like it had touched storms. And on its back sat a man she didn't recognize. Until she did. They said he had vanished years ago. A Comanche boy born to poverty, raised in silence, and gone before he could be counted among the living. But the man who now dismounted in front of her didn't look like a memory. He looked like a reckoning, dressed in black denim and hand-sewn leather, his face carved by the wind and eyes sharp with purpose. He said nothing. He didn't need to, because the dust still held her bouquet, and somehow he'd found it. No one knew where he had gone, or how he had come back so changed. Years ago, the townsfolk had whispered his name like it was something cursed, something they could pretend never belonged. His mother had worked scrubbing floors at the same church. That now stood empty behind Clara May. She had died with nothing. but blisters on her palms and a quiet prayer that her boy would escape this town's cruelty. And he did. They called him Eli Greyfeather back then, the half-Comanche orphan with no boots, no coat, and no future. But now, no one dared call him anything but Sir. The man on horseback who rode into land deals and left with entire counties in his pocket. Oil rigs, freight lines, vineyards. His name echoed through boardrooms across Texas like a shadow people couldn't outrun. He wasn't just rich. He was untouchable. And yet, here he was, riding toward a girl in a tattered wedding dress, sitting in a forgotten barn like a discarded chapter. Clara May didn't speak. Her voice had folded in on itself like paper set on fire. But when he handed her the wilted bouquet, still stained with chapel dust, her fingers trembled like someone who just remembered what it meant to be noticed. He didn't ask questions. He simply sat down on the ground beside her. Not close. Enough to intrude, but not far enough to disappear. The world didn't make space for people like them. Not back then. But now, somehow, the earth beneath them felt less cruel with him there. He didn't look at her like a broken bride. He looked at her like someone who saw the world burn and decided to build something better out of the ashes dot by sunset. He had built a fire from scraps and cleared a place for her to rest. The barn, once a tomb of forgotten things, started to breathe again. That night, the air felt heavier, like a storm was watching, waiting to decide who deserved rain and who deserved lightning. But neither of them spoke, because some wounds needed silence more than sympathy. The next morning, Clara May rose before the sun. Her dress, now streaked with mud, clung to her like second skin. But there was something new in her spine. Not pride, not yet, but defiance. She walked out into the field and let the wind take the last piece of her veil. It floated off like a ghost returning to the sky. And when she turned around, Eli was still there, standing, waiting, as if her next breath was part of his plan. He took her back, not to the chapel, but to town. Not through the main road, but through the old cattle path that curved behind. The hills. No one saw them arrive. But by the time they reached the empty general store his family once swept the floors of, he had already handed the keys to her. Clara May didn't understand, but Eli did. He had bought the entire street, years ago. They kicked him out of it, sneered at his mother, spit near his boots, and refused to sell even scraps to his name. Now he owned it all, every door, every brick, every broken window, and he had returned not to flaunt it, but to give it meaning. He didn't say it, but Clara May felt it. She was never meant to marry a man who ran away. She was meant to survive long enough to meet someone who never would. Word traveled fast in towns that only knew how to gossip when no one was watching. By nightfall, the old pastor peeked through dusty blinds. The baker held her tongue. And the same women who had clutched their pearls at Clara's fall from grace now whispered in awe of the man beside her. They didn't recognize him, of course. Not in this version. But their children did. The boys who once threw stones at him now watched their fathers kneel at the bank he now owned. The girls who once laughed at his ragged shirt now wore dresses stitched from his empire's wealth. But Eli didn't come for revenge. He came because sometimes justice doesn't speak. It just rides in slow, steady, and silent. By the time Clara May stepped into the general store again, it was no longer just a building. It was a message. The crooked shelves had been cleared, the dust swept away, and a fresh coat of paint now covered the same walls where she'd once been. Denied credit for a loaf of bread. The bell above the door rang like it finally had something to celebrate. And though her hands still trembled, they no longer trembled from shame. Outside, the street had gone quiet. People passed by with stiff necks and sideways glances. Too proud to stare, but too curious to look away. They remembered the dress. They remembered the bouquet in the dust. But what burned deeper was who she stood beside now. The same boy they once told her to avoid. Now a man who could buy the land beneath their feet and plant trees where their lies had grown. Eli didn't push her. He simply opened the space, lit the path, and let her decide if she'd walk it. Clara May stepped forward slowly, unsure if the ground would hold her, but it did. She touched the old register, cleaned the smudged mirror, and for the first time in days, looked at herself without flinching. There were dark circles beneath her eyes, yes, and the ghost of a bruise where her faith had shattered. But there was something else now, too. A woman. Not a bride. Not a victim. A woman choosing what to do with her second beginning. By week's end, the store had reopened. But this time, it didn't sell what it used to. The shelves were filled with handmade goods from local widows, single mothers, and girls who'd been told their dreams had an expiration date. Clara called it dust and grace, and everyone knew why. At first, they stayed away. Pride is a slow poison in small towns, and no one wanted to admit that the girl they had discarded had become the flame people now warmed their hands by. But eventually, curiosity cracked stubborn doors. A few came in just to look. Some came to scoff. But none left the same, because Clara didn't preach. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply gave it in the form of warmth, kindness, and unspoken courage that couldn't be priced. Meanwhile, Eli worked in the background like the wind. He funded a school, paid off overdue mortgages, repaired the church roof without signing his name. He didn't stand in the spotlight. He handed it to Clara and stepped back. That was his justice. Not humiliation, but elevation. He didn't rebuild to be praised. He rebuilt because someone had to, but not everyone was ready for change. There was one man who watched it all from behind tinted windows and a bitter heart. Matthew Crane, the groom who fled the altar, who promised her forever and delivered nothing but ruin. His family had owned the bank for decades. His father ran the mayor's office like it was a private club. And now, both were crumbling under the quiet pressure of one man's return and one woman's rise. He hadn't left town. Not truly. He'd just disappeared long enough for people to forget his mess. But now, with Ellie's name on deeds and Clara's face in shop windows, he couldn't stay silent. He tried first with whispers, claimed Eli was laundering money, that Clara was nothing but a gold digger dressed in white. But the town didn't bite. The story had changed. And no one believed liars who once left a girl crying alone at the altar. So Matthew tried something else. One night, the store's windows were shattered. The sign pulled from its hooks. The shelves smashed. It was meant to be a warning. But instead, it became a turning point. Clara didn't cry this time. She stood among the broken glass in her boots and dusty apron, swept the shards into a pile, and left the sign out front with a note painted in bold red letters. You can break the windows, but not the truth. That morning, a line formed at the door, not because of pity, but because the town had remembered what honor looked like, and it had a face again. It happened the night after the windows were repaired. A soft wind stirred through the alleyways, and silence hung unusually thick over the town. The store was locked. The lights were off. But across the street, a shadow watched, waiting, pacing, burning with the kind of pride that rots a man from the inside out. Matthew Crane couldn't stand it anymore. He didn't see Clara as a survivor. He saw her as a reflection of what he'd lost and what he'd run from. Her rise made his cowardice louder. Her strength made his weakness visible. And Eli was everything Matthew's family had warned against. A boy with no name, no power, no place. But now he owned everything. So Matthew struck the only way he knew how. With gasoline. With fire. The blaze tore through the back of dust and grace like a mouth hungry for proof that hope was fragile. Flames curled through the rafters, eating handmade goods, swallowing the walls Clara had painted with her own hands. By the time the town awoke, smoke had already risen like a dark banner above their silence. But what shocked them wasn't the fire. It was what happened next. Clara May ran straight into the smoke before anyone could stop her. Not to save merchandise, but to pull out the ledger, the names, the debts she'd forgiven, the records of the women she had helped. That book mattered more than inventory. It held stories, and she wasn't going to let them burn to. Eli arrived moments later, riding through the smoke on horseback, coat whipping in the wind like something out of a legend. He didn't say a word. He just dismounted, pulled her from the collapsing doorframe, and wrapped his arms around her like the fire couldn't touch her if he held on tight enough. The fire was controlled by morning. The damage was heavy, but the building still stood. Barely. But now, so did Clara. And something in the town shifted. The sheriff, who had turned a blind eye for too long, showed up with fresh warrants, a trail of receipts, and a half-empty gas can led straight to Matthew's family estate. There were no speeches, just the cold sound of handcuffs and a former groom screaming about how it wasn't supposed to end like this. But justice doesn't wait for apologies. It walks in when someone decides to stand. Within days, volunteers lined up to help rebuild Dust and Grace. People who once ignored her now offered their hands. Men brought lumber. Women brought quilts. Children painted signs in the dust. It wasn't pity anymore. It was something deeper. Respect. And through it all, Eli never left her side. He didn't offer to buy her a new building. He asked how she wanted it built. He didn't silence her. He amplified her. When they laid the new foundation, he placed the first stone, not with ceremony, but with quiet certainty, like he was rebuilding not just a store, but every broken promise she had ever been handed. Clara never asked for revenge. She never needed Matthew to suffer. What she needed was to rewrite her ending, not with fire, but with grace. That winter, the new Dust and Grace opened under snowfall. Warm light spilled through tall windows. Shelves gleamed with new creations, new partnerships, and new beginnings. The ledger, still singed from the fire, sat in a glass case, a symbol of survival, not perfection, but perseverance. Eli stood beside her when the door was unlocked. But he didn't cut the ribbon. Clara did, because this wasn't about a millionaire saving a bride. This was about a bride who refused to stay broken, and a man who made space for her to rise. They came from miles away that spring, not to buy, not just to look, but to feel something that had become rare in most towns. The new Dust and Grace wasn't just a store anymore. It was a gathering place, a breathing thing. The same building that once held ashes now hummed with stories. Every crack in the wood whispered of pain. Every polished shelf reflected redemption. Clara May never hung her old wedding dress. She didn't need to. Her strength was no longer stitched into fabric. It was carved into how she stood, how she greeted every customer with a gaze that said, "I know what it means to be forgotten, and I won't let you be." Eli, still silent in the way the wind is, had quietly bought the land around the store, but instead of building empires, he planted wildflowers. He hired former outcasts to work in his new cattle ventures, bought horses for local orphans, and funded scholarships for girls who thought they'd never leave town. The man who once swept dirt from chapel steps now paved roads in gold, not for himself, but so others wouldn't trip where he once fell. Clara's story had reached the ears of women far beyond the county lines. Letters came in from those who had also been left behind, laughed at, or nearly broken. They sent scraps of their own stories, and Clara began collecting them. She stitched them into a quilt, not just of fabric, but of wounds turned into wings. One afternoon, a little girl walked into the shop holding her mother's hand. She paused, pointed at the glass case where the scorched ledger sat, and asked, "Did someone try to burn the truth?" Clara smiled and said, "Yes, but fire can't erase what's already rooted." The girl didn't understand. Not yet. But someday she would. Outside, the town had changed. The same church that once closed its doors now opened them wider. The same mayor who once bowed to powerful families now asked Clara and Eli to speak at public events. The same streets that had once been silent when injustice happened now echoed with applause when ailing took place and Matthew Crane never returned. His father's name was stripped from the town square, but no one celebrated his fall, because this wasn't about vengeance. It never was. It was about memory, about what the town remembered, and what it chose to forget. And on the anniversary of the day she left her bouquet in the dust, Clara walked back to that chapel. The doors were open now. The choir sang again. But she didn't step inside. Instead, she placed a fresh bouquet, wildflowers, not roses, exactly where the old one had fallen. No ceremony, no audience, just her and the breeze. Behind her, Eli stood quietly. They didn't need vows. They had something stronger, a shared storm, a rebuilt world, and the kind of love that doesn't start at the altar, but after everything has burned.